1793 marked the year the heavy timbered door slammed against the damp stone wall, a sound that reverberated like a gunshot through the suffocating darkness of the cell. Two men, their silhouettes framed by the harsh yellow light of a lantern, stepped into the room, where the air already hung heavy with the stench of mildew, stale straw, and unwashed bodies. They had not come to offer mercy or to deliver news of a reprieve, but to extract the one thing the woman on the pallet had left to live for. The woman was Marie Antoinette, once the Queen of France, now reduced to prisoner number 280.
A shadow of the figure who had once walked the mirrored halls of Versailles. She scrambled up from the rotting mattress, her limbs stiff from the damp cold that seeped through the limestone of the Temple prison, placing her body between the intruders and the small, terrified boy who clung to her tattered skirts. This was Louis Charles, the heir to a throne that had been smashed by the hammer of the French Revolution, and the order the guards carried was absolute. The Committee of Public Safety had decreed that the child must be removed, not just to another cell, but to a different world entirely, one designed to scour the royal blood from his veins through psychological erasure. The mother fought with a desperation that startled the armed men, scratching and screaming, pleading with a voice that had cracked from months of silence and grief, begging them to kill her rather than take her son. For an hour, the cell was filled with the sounds of a struggle that was as physical as it was political. But strength born of malnutrition was no match for the brute force of the Revolutionary Guard. They pried the weeping child's fingers from her dress, and as they dragged him into the corridor, his cries of "Mama" grew fainter, swallowed by the winding stone labyrinth of the prison, leaving Marie Antoinette alone in a silence that was louder than the screaming. If you enjoy these deep dives into the dark histories of the past, please like this video and subscribe to our channel, and let us know in the comments where you are listening from, as we explore how the mightiest figures were brought to their knees. To understand the sheer magnitude of this fall, one must look back at the trajectory that brought an Austrian archduchess to this dungeon. Born Maria Antonia, she was the currency of a diplomatic treaty, sent to France to marry the future Louis XVI, a man who preferred locksmithing to ruling. She arrived in a country that was already teetering on the edge of financial collapse, yet she was thrust into the theater of Versailles, a golden cage where etiquette was a weapon and every gesture was a performance analyzed by thousands of courtiers.
The public turned on her, not just because of the deficit, but because she represented the foreign other, the Austrian woman who was an easy scapegoat for failed harvests and rising bread prices. By the time the Bastille fell and the royal family was dragged from the Tuileries Palace, the propaganda machine had already painted her as a monster, a harpy who feasted on the blood of the poor. But the woman left sobbing on the floor of the Temple prison was stripped of all that artifice. She was suffering from a rapidly advancing cancer, likely uterine, which caused her severe hemorrhaging and constant pain, a physical agony that mirrored her emotional ruin. The separation from her son was the first step in a calculated program of destruction orchestrated by the radical Jacobins. The boy, Louis Charles, was handed over to a man named Antoine Simon, a cobbler and a fervent revolutionary who was tasked with the re-education of the prince. This was a polite term for abuse. Simon's instructions were to turn the child into a good citizen of the Republic, which in practice meant forcing him to drink alcohol until he passed out, beating him when he showed any sign of his aristocratic upbringing, and teaching him a vocabulary of obscenities directed at his own family. The guards in the prison below would often hear the drunken shouts of the cobbler and the confused, pained cries of the boy, sounds that drifted down to the cell where Marie Antoinette lay awake, tormented by her inability to protect him. The cruelty was the point. The revolutionaries did not just want to kill the queen, they wanted to kill the idea of her, to degrade her so thoroughly that no one could ever view her with sympathy again. In August of 1793, the nightmare shifted locations. Marie Antoinette was woken in the middle of the night and told she was being transferred to the Conciergerie. This fortress, sitting on the Ile de la Cité, was known as the Antechamber to the Guillotine, a place where few exited alive. She was marched through the dark streets, leaving her daughter and sister-in-law behind in the temple, and processed into a cell that was even worse than the last. It was a damp, subterranean room where the water from the Seine River often seeped up through the floorboards, making the air thick with humidity and disease.
Here, the former queen was placed under the watch of 2 gendarmes who were ordered never to take their eyes off her. They sat behind a screen, smoking pipes and playing cards, their presence ensuring she had no privacy, not even to wash or use the latrine. She was given a few ragged items of clothing, her famous wardrobe reduced to a black dress that she mended herself with a needle and thread she had managed to hide. Her health deteriorated rapidly in the Conciergerie. Her eyesight began to fail in the gloom, and the constant bleeding left her weak and prone to fainting spells. Yet, amidst this institutional cruelty, there were small, subversive acts of humanity. The jailer's wife and a maid named Rosalie Lamourlière took pity on the woman they saw not as a monster, but as a suffering human being. Rosalie would secretly bring her warm broth, clean linens, and even cardboard to place over the dampest parts of the floor, risking her own life to provide these small comforts. These moments of grace were fleeting, however, as the political machinery of the terror geared up for its show trial. The trial of Marie Antoinette was never about justice, it was about political theater. The outcome was decided before the gavel ever banged. The prosecutor, Fouquier-Tinville, a man who sent thousands to their deaths with the stroke of a pen, drafted an indictment that included every conceivable crime: squandering the nation's treasury, conspiring with foreign enemies, and orchestrating orgies at Versailles. But the Jacobins felt these charges were not enough to ensure the total moral destruction of the Queen in the eyes of the public. They needed something that would sever any lingering bond of maternal respect the common people might feel. In a move that remains one of the darkest chapters of the French Revolution, they brought the 8-year-old Louis Charles into a deposition room. Broken by months of abuse, confused by alcohol, and manipulated by Sinan, the boy signed a statement accusing his mother and his aunt of incestuous sexual abuse. When the trial began on October 14, 1793, Marie Antoinette sat in the prisoner's dock, pale and emaciated, but possessing a dignity that unnerved her accusers.
She answered the political charges with surprising clarity, her voice steady despite her physical weakness. Then, Fouquier-Tinville played his trump card. He read the accusation of incest to the packed courtroom. The silence that followed was heavy with shock. Even the most hardened revolutionaries shifted in their seats, uncomfortable with the depravity of the charge. Marie Antoinette did not answer immediately. When pressed, she stood up, her face flushed with emotion, and turned away from the judges to face the crowd. She cried out that nature itself refused to answer such a charge made against a mother, and she appealed to all the mothers in the room. For a brief, dangerous moment, the electricity in the room shifted. The market women in the gallery who had come to jeer fell silent, some even weeping. The prosecutor, realizing he had overplayed his hand and risked creating a martyr, quickly moved to close the proceedings. The jury, terrified that any show of leniency would result in their own heads rolling into the basket, deliberated for only a short time before returning a verdict of guilty on all counts. The sentence was death by guillotine, to be carried out within hours. Back in her cell, by the light of a flickering candle, Marie Antoinette wrote her final testament. It was a letter to her sister-in-law, Madame Elizabeth, a document that revealed the depth of her transformation. There was no anger, only a profound sadness and a request that her children never seek to avenge her death. She wrote of her love for them and her faith in God. This letter, like so many other things in her life, was intercepted by the revolutionary authorities and never delivered, ending up in the pocket of Robespierre, a souvenir of his victory. As dawn broke on October 16, the executioner Henri Sanson entered her cell. He was not there to comfort her, but to prepare the body for the spectacle. He roughly cut her hair, which had turned stark white from the stress of the past year, shearing it close to the skull to ensure the blade would have a clean bath. Her hands were bound behind her back with a rope, tied so tightly that she complained of the pain, though her complaints fell on deaf ears. Unlike her husband, Louis XVI, who had been allowed to travel to the scaffold in a closed carriage, Marie Antoinette was forced to ride in an open tumbrel, a common cart used for criminals.
This was the final, calculated insult, intended to expose her to the wrath of the mob one last time.
For over an hour, the cart jolted over the cobblestones of Paris, forcing her to maintain her balance with her hands tied. The crowds were immense, a sea of angry faces, shouting insults, spitting, and jeering at the woman they blamed for their hunger. The artist Jacques-Louis David sketched her as she passed his window, capturing a woman with a jutting jaw, eyes closed to the world, sitting with a rigid, defiant posture that refused to acknowledge the hatred surrounding her. She was no longer the queen of Rococo fashion. She was a woman facing the void. When the cart finally arrived at the Place de la Revolution, now the Place de la Concorde, the guillotine stood waiting, its blade glinting in the autumn sun. She stepped down from the cart and climbed the scaffold steps without assistance, losing a shoe in the process. Legend says she stepped on the executioner's foot and apologized, saying, "Pardon me, sir, I did not do it on purpose." It was a moment of reflex politeness that underscored the surreal horror of the situation. At 12:15 p.m., the blade fell. The executioner lifted her severed head by the hair to show the crowd, and a roar of "Vive la République" went up. But it was a cheer mixed with an uneasy realization that blood had become the only currency of the state. Her body was unceremoniously dumped into a wooden coffin and taken to the Madeleine Cemetery, where it was thrown into a mass grave and covered with quicklime to speed up decomposition. The ledger for her burial cost was listed simply as "Widow Capet," for the coffin, 6 livres. The revolution moved on, but the blood did not stop flowing. The irony of the terror was that it had an insatiable appetite. The very men who orchestrated the Queen's death, including Hébert and Robespierre, would soon find themselves in the same tumbrils, traveling the same route to the same blade, victims of the paranoia they had weaponized. The tragedy of the royal family continued in the dark tower of the Temple. The young Louis Charles, now titularly Louis XVII, remained in solitary confinement. The psychological torture turned into neglect. He was left in a dark cell with no sanitation, his food pushed through a barred window.
He stopped speaking, stopped washing, and curled into himself. When authorities finally checked on him months later, they found a child covered in sores, his limbs swollen from rickets and tuberculosis, living in a pile of filth. He died in 1795 at the age of 10. A silent victim whose suffering was perhaps the most damning indictment of the revolutionary excess. The doctor who performed the autopsy, shaken by the condition of the boy's body, secretly removed his heart and preserved it in a jar of alcohol. This heart would travel a strange, centuries-long journey, passed from hand to hand, stolen, retrieved, and finally, in the 21st century, subjected to DNA testing that confirmed it belonged to the son of Marie Antoinette, laying to rest the rumors that the prince had escaped. The only survivor of the immediate family was the eldest daughter, Marie Thérèse, known as Madame Royale. She endured years of isolation in the temple, unaware that her mother and aunt were dead, believing they were in another cell. She was finally released in a prisoner exchange with Austria, but she emerged as a woman carved from ice, forever traumatized by the sounds of the prison and the silence of her loss. She spent the rest of her life wandering the courts of Europe, a living ghost of the Ancien regime, writing memoirs that tried to set the record straight against the mountains of propaganda that had defined her family's image. It was not until the Bourbon Restoration in 1815 that the bodies of Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI were sought. A survivor who remembered the location of the mass grave guided the searchers. They found the bones, identified by the distinctive jawline of the Queen and the remnants of a garter, and transported them to the Basilica of Saint-Denis. There they were interred with the pomp and ceremony that had been denied to them in life, but a marble tomb could not undo the history written in blood. The story of Marie Antoinette's imprisonment and death is more than just a biography of a queen. It is a lens into the mechanics of dehumanization. It shows how quickly a society can strip away the rights of an individual when fear and ideology take the wheel. The pamphlets that demonized her, the rumors that became facts, and the show trial that mocked the concept of justice are not just relics of the 18th century. They are warnings about the fragility of truth in times of upheaval.
The dark, damp cell of the Conciergerie, which you can still visit today in Paris, stands as a silent monument to the woman who entered it as a hated symbol and left it as a broken human being. Her story challenges us to look beyond the caricatures of "let them eat cake," a phrase she likely never said, and see the terrifying reality of a mother caught in the gears of a history that had no room for mercy. If you found this detailed exploration of the French Revolution fascinating, please help us by hitting the like button, as it allows us to keep bringing these hidden histories to light. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. We are genuinely curious to hear your thoughts. Do you view Marie Antoinette as a villain of the state or a victim of circumstance? Leave your answer in the comments below. The legacy of these events is not just in the history books, but in the way we understand power, propaganda, and the enduring human capacity for both cruelty and resilience. Thank you for watching, and join us next time as we unlock another door into the past.